Something strange is happening inside the WNBA right now, and most fans don't realize how serious it's becoming. For the first time in league history, owners quietly put real, life-changing money on the table. Not promises, not future projections, actual offers. And instead of celebrating, players were told to do one thing: sign nothing. That order didn't come from the league. It didn't come from the owners. It came from inside the Players Union itself. And the name attached to that decision has now split the league down the middle. Because this isn't just about money anymore. It's about control, loyalty, and a power struggle that could permanently reshape the WNBA. And once you see how all the pieces connect, it becomes impossible to unsee. For years, the conversation around the WNBA followed the same predictable rhythm. Players were underpaid. The league needed growth. Change was coming, eventually. Public opinion stayed mostly sympathetic because the argument felt simple. More revenue should mean better pay. And for a long time, there was no real counter to that narrative. Until the owners made their move. Behind closed doors, the league introduced offers that instantly changed the stakes. These weren't symbolic increases or incremental raises designed to stall negotiations. The numbers were dramatic. So dramatic that once they surfaced, the entire tone of the debate shifted almost overnight. What had been framed as a fight for fairness suddenly became a question of refusal. Fans who had supported the union began asking uncomfortable questions. If the money is already there, why is nothing moving forward? If salaries are set to multiply, why does everything feel stuck? The league didn't announce a victory lap. They didn't run ads. They didn't grandstand. They simply let the numbers speak. And once they did, silence followed. The kind of silence that usually signals something breaking behind the scenes. Because the pressure wasn't coming from the public anymore. It was coming from inside the locker rooms. But before players could even react individually, a single message cut through the noise. One that changed everything. As qualifying offers began circulating, confusion spread fast. Some players saw dollar figures they had never imagined earning in the WNBA. Others started doing quiet math, mortgages, stability, futures that suddenly looked possible without overseas seasons or constant financial stress. And then the instruction landed. No one signs anything. This wasn't a rumor or a leaked suggestion. It was a direct message from union leadership, delivered with clarity and authority. Any contract signed now, players were told, would fall under the existing agreement, not the new one still being negotiated. On paper, the logic sounded strategic. In reality, it put players in an impossible position. Because while leadership spoke in terms of long-term leverage, individual careers don't operate on theory. They operate on timelines, on health, on guarantees. What made this moment explode wasn't just the instruction itself, it was who delivered it. Breanna Stewart wasn't just another voice in the room. She wasn't a fringe representative or background figure. She was a vice president of the Players Union. And that's when people started looking closer. Because Stewart wasn't just speaking as a player. She was speaking as something else, too. And that's where the story takes a turn most people still aren't ready to talk about. Once Breanna Stewart's message reached players, the reaction wasn't loud. It was uneasy. No emergency meetings. No public backlash. No fiery statements. Just hesitation. Because when someone in a position of authority tells you to walk away from guaranteed money, your first instinct is to trust that they see something you don't. Union leadership is supposed to protect the collective, even when the short-term sacrifice feels uncomfortable. But that trust depends on one thing above all else: alignment. And the more people looked into Stewart's role, the more that alignment came into question. Breanna Stewart wasn't just a union vice president advocating patience at the bargaining table. She was also deeply involved in the ownership side of a separate professional basketball venture, a league positioned as an alternative, not a supplement. That distinction matters. In labor negotiations, even the appearance of divided loyalty can destabilize everything. It doesn't require proof of wrongdoing. It doesn't require accusations or scandals. All it takes is doubt. And doubt spreads fast when money is involved. Owners immediately recognized the problem. From their perspective, negotiations were no longer taking place between two sides with a shared interest in the league's success. They were now negotiating with someone who stood to benefit if progress slowed. That realization alone changed the tone in the room. Because how do you negotiate in good faith when the person urging delay might gain leverage elsewhere by doing so? Every demand started to feel heavier. Every refusal felt more intentional. Every delay felt strategic. But the most damaging effect wasn't happening across the table. It was happening among the players themselves. For players scraping together off-season income, overseas contracts, and side hustles just to stay afloat, the idea of rejecting guaranteed raises felt surreal. For them, this wasn't about maximizing future leverage. It was about finally achieving stability in a career that offers very little margin for error. And yet, the instruction was clear. Hold the line. Sign nothing. Wait. That created a psychological fracture. Because if leadership was truly aligned with every player's reality, would the message have been so absolute? Would there have been room for nuance? For individual circumstances? Instead, the directive felt rigid, almost insulated from the consequences it imposed on others. And that's when whispers started. Not accusations. Not rebellion. Just quiet questions. Why is someone with alternative business interests telling us to delay? Who actually benefits from this stall? What happens if this league loses momentum while another one gains it? Those questions didn't need answers to be dangerous. Their existence alone was enough. From the outside, this might look like a technicality, an obscure governance issue buried in legal language. But inside the league, it felt personal. Because for the first time, players were being asked to trust leadership without understanding the full picture. And that trust is everything in collective bargaining. Once it cracks, unity becomes performative rather than real. The union still spoke with one voice publicly. But privately, the harmony was gone. Some players began to see the negotiations less as a fight against ownership and more as a struggle between competing visions of the league's future. One vision prioritized immediate security, locking in the biggest pay increases the league had ever seen and stabilizing careers that are often painfully short. The other prioritized leverage, patience, and long-term positioning, even if that meant turning down money that could change lives right now. And hovering over all of it was the uncomfortable reality that one of the loudest voices pushing delay had options. Options most players did not. That imbalance, not money, is what truly destabilized the union's position. Because solidarity only works when everyone feels equally exposed. And once players realized that wasn't the case, the negotiations stopped being about owners versus players. It became about trust versus uncertainty. And that shift is what forced the league to stop negotiating emotionally and start negotiating strategically. Once trust inside negotiations began to fracture, the league didn't rush to respond. There were no emergency statements, no public blame, no aggressive posturing meant for headlines. Instead, the owners did something far more dangerous. They waited. Silence became their leverage. Behind the scenes, the league had already accepted a hard truth. Negotiations were no longer happening on a level field. When union leadership carries divided interests, the usual rhythms of bargaining break down. Emotional appeals stop working. Long-term promises lose credibility. So the owners adjusted. They stopped arguing philosophy and started applying pressure in the most effective way possible, without saying a word. That pressure came in the form of qualifying offers. On the surface, these offers looked routine, technically legal, procedural, almost boring. But their timing was intentional, and their purpose was surgical. The league never expected players to sign them. That wasn't the point. The point was exposure. Every offer forced a player to confront a number attached to their name. A real figure. A baseline. A reminder of how much their labor was already worth, and how much more was being proposed in the new agreement. For the first time, negotiations stopped being abstract. They became personal. Each player now had something concrete to measure against the union strategy. Waiting wasn't just a concept anymore. It had a cost, a visible one, and the league knew exactly what that would do. Because once players start calculating opportunity cost, collective bargaining enters dangerous territory. The offers didn't break union rules. They didn't undermine the process legally. But psychologically, they were devastating. Suddenly, every delay had a dollar amount attached to it. Every week without progress meant another moment players had to justify turning down money they could already touch. The league understood something crucial. You don't weaken a union by attacking it directly. You weaken it by making its members think independently. And that's exactly what happened. Players began asking questions, not publicly but internally. What happens if negotiations drag into next season? What happens if injuries hit before a new deal is finalized? What happens if the public support disappears completely? These weren't disloyal thoughts. They were survival instincts. And the owners knew that. They also understood something else that rarely gets discussed. Careers in the WNBA are short. Guaranteed money is rare. And leverage disappears the moment a player steps off the court. By putting real numbers in front of players, the league forced them to confront a reality that ideology can't erase. Time favors management. Every week that passed without resolution shifted pressure away from owners and onto players, especially those without endorsements, without savings, without safety nets. And the most effective part of the strategy? The owners never had to say a single word about it. They didn't accuse union leadership of bad faith. They didn't highlight conflicts of interest. They didn't comment on internal divisions. They let silence do the work. Because silence allows imagination to fill the gaps. Players started wondering what else the league might be willing to do. How far owners were prepared to go. Whether holding out was still a united effort or a gamble with unequal consequences. By the time fans noticed the shift, it was already too late. The power balance had moved. Not because owners demanded it, but because they created a situation where waiting felt riskier than acting. And once that happens, no amount of messaging can fully restore unity. This wasn't just a negotiation tactic. It was an endgame. And it set the stage for the numbers, the ones that would completely collapse the old narrative, to do what rhetoric never could. Once the salary figures started circulating, the conversation changed instantly. Not publicly, not on social media, but in private moments, the kind that matter most. Players didn't need press releases or breakdown videos to understand what was happening. They just needed a calculator. For years, pay discussions had lived in hypotheticals, revenue projections, future growth, promises tied to visibility and expansion that might come later. This was different. The numbers on the table weren't abstract. They were immediate, defined, and shockingly large by WNBA standards. Salaries that once topped out around a couple $100,000 were now projected to explode past the $1 million mark. Not at the end of a career. Not after a decade of waiting. Within a single agreement. For some players, this meant earning in one season what would have previously taken 5, sometimes even 6, years to make. That kind of jump doesn't just change paychecks. It changes lives. And the most overlooked detail in this entire debate is who benefits the most. It isn't the household names. Stars already have endorsement income, brand leverage, and long-term financial cushions. They're insulated from delays. They can afford patience. The real beneficiaries are the players most fans never talk about. The rotation players. The veterans clinging to roster spots. The athletes whose careers could end with a single bad landing. For them, this wasn't about maximizing leverage over time. It was about security, right now. Money to buy a home instead of renting year to year. Money to stop relying on overseas leagues just to survive. Money that turns a fragile career into something stable. That's why the figures were so disruptive. Because once those players saw what was possible, holding out stopped feeling strategic and started feeling dangerous. Every delay meant passing on wealth that might never be offered again. And the math made that reality impossible to ignore. Turning down $500,000 a year, one alone wasn't a symbolic sacrifice. It was the equivalent of walking past multiple seasons' worth of income and pretending it wasn't there. That kind of decision weighs heavily on people whose earning window is painfully short. The union could talk about long-term gains. But careers don't operate on optimism. They operate on opportunity. And opportunity doesn't wait. This is where the narrative truly fractured. Because from the outside, refusing the deal looked ideological. But from the inside, it felt personal. Players weren't rejecting ownership. They were rejecting certainty. And certainty is rare in professional sports, especially in a league where financial stability has never been guaranteed. Once the numbers became real, the question stopped being, is this fair? It became, what if this is the best it ever gets? That's not a question leadership can answer for someone else. And that's why the numbers did what years of arguments never could. They forced players to think as individuals. And once that happens, collective bargaining enters its most dangerous phase. Because unity survives on belief. But belief struggles against reality, especially when reality comes with commas and zeros attached. And that's when silence inside the locker rooms grew heavier than any protest outside them. For a long time, the WNBA players' argument lived in safe territory. underpaid athletes, growing league, fairness over profit. Those ideas resonated because they were simple, and because fans wanted them to be true. Supporting players felt morally clean. It didn't require nuance. But once the salary numbers surfaced, that emotional clarity disappeared. The public didn't turn instantly. It drifted. Questions started replacing slogans. If owners are offering massive increases, why does nothing move forward? If the league is still losing money, how much leverage actually exists? And if this deal is as bad as leadership claims, why do the numbers look so different? That's when optics began doing real damage. Protest tactics that might have energized supporters early on started to feel misplaced. Inflatable props, visual stunts, messaging that leaned more toward frustration than persuasion. To casual fans, it didn't look like disciplined negotiation anymore. It looked chaotic. And perception matters, especially in a league still fighting for legitimacy. Instead of strengthening sympathy, the optics diluted it. The conversation stopped being about systemic issues and started sounding personal, even emotional. That shift is deadly in labor disputes, because emotion is easy to dismiss when money is visible. Fans weren't hearing strategy. They were seeing resistance. And resistance is only compelling when the alternative looks worse. Here it didn't. Every time another number circulated, another fan quietly switched sides, not out of hostility but confusion. Social media reflected it first. Posts that once defended the union now questioned it. Comment sections filled with the same recurring theme. The money is already there. That phrase became a problem. Because once it takes hold, no amount of messaging can fully erase it. The union found itself trapped between two realities. Privately, leadership knew walking away entirely wasn't realistic. Publicly, backing down risked looking weak. That tension froze everything. Meanwhile, the league didn't have to say a word. The more the union leaned into visible protest, the more disconnected it looked from the financial reality fans were now aware of. And this wasn't just about public relations. Public opinion influences sponsors. Sponsors influence broadcast partners. Broadcast partners influence revenue. Once doubt creeps into that chain, momentum slows. The WNBA is still in a fragile growth phase. It doesn't have the luxury of alienating casual viewers, the very people needed to justify expansion, media deals, and long-term investment. As support eroded, pressure didn't just increase. It changed direction. Instead of pushing owners, it pressed inward, onto players themselves. Players started noticing the shift. Friends, family members, even longtime supporters asking the same uncomfortable question. Why turn this down? When the people closest to you stop cheering and start questioning, it becomes impossible to ignore. That's when negotiations stop feeling external. They become internal. And once that happens, the union loses its greatest weapon: unity. Because unity isn't just agreement at the table. It's belief outside the room. And that belief was slipping away, quietly, steadily, and in ways no protest could reverse. By the time public support started fading, the real damage was already happening out of view. Inside locker rooms, inside group chats, inside quiet conversations that never make headlines. This wasn't a loud rebellion. It was something far more dangerous. A split in reality. On one side were the players who could afford patience. Established stars. Players with endorsement income. Players whose names alone guarantee roster spots for years to come. For them, waiting felt like strategy. Holding out made sense. Time didn't threaten their security. On the other side were players living a completely different version of the league. Veterans on short contracts. Rotation players fighting to stay relevant. Athletes one injury away from being replaced. For them, delay wasn't leverage. It was exposure. Every missed season. Every stalled agreement. Every unresolved negotiation increased the risk that their earning window would close before stability ever arrived. And here's the part most people don't understand. Union solidarity is easy when sacrifice is equal. But when sacrifice becomes uneven, unity turns fragile. Some players began asking questions they never expected to ask. What happens if negotiations stretch another year? What happens if the league moves on without us? What happens if this money disappears and never comes back? These weren't selfish questions. They were survival questions. And no amount of collective messaging can silence survival instincts. What made this tension worse was the silence from leadership. No acknowledgement of individual circumstances. No flexibility. No recognition that not all careers are built the same. The message remained rigid. Hold the line. Trust the process. Wait. But trust erodes when people feel unseen. And slowly, players stopped voicing concerns publicly. Not because they agreed, but because disagreement felt dangerous. That's when resentment takes root. Not outward anger. Quiet doubt. The kind that spreads through body language, tone, and hesitation rather than words. Some players began mentally separating themselves from the group. Not in defiance, but in self-protection. And when that happens, collective bargaining loses its backbone. Because unity doesn't collapse all at once. It weakens, then wobbles, then waits for the final push. That push came from an idea no one wanted to acknowledge openly. Replacement. Not as a threat, not as a plan, as a possibility. And the mere existence of that possibility changed everything. Because once players believed the league might move forward without them, the power dynamic shifts permanently. And that realization leads directly to the most uncomfortable leverage of all. The one everyone pretends doesn't exist. The word replacement never appeared in official statements. No owner threatened it. No executive confirmed it. No press release hinted at it. But inside the league, the idea didn't need to be spoken. Everyone understood it. Because for the first time in WNBA history, the talent pipeline was overflowing. A new generation was already here, younger, cheaper, and carrying something the league had never fully enjoyed before. Built-in demand. These weren't unknown prospects. They were household names before playing a single professional minute. Players with massive college followings, social media traction, and rivalries fans were already invested in. From a business standpoint, this changes the entire equation. In past negotiations, veterans held leverage because there was no clear alternative. If experienced players walked away, the product would collapse. That's no longer true. Now imagine this from the league's perspective. Rookies entering on entry-level deals. Players eager for opportunity. Athletes who haven't spent years grinding under low pay, and therefore feel no attachment to past grievances. For them, the league isn't something to fix. It's something to join. And that distinction matters. Because leverage only works when replacement is impossible. Once replacement becomes plausible, even theoretically, power shifts immediately. Fans don't tune in solely for tenure. They tune in for competition, narratives, and moments. A season built around new rivalries, explosive scorers, and nationally recognizable stars wouldn't feel like a downgrade. To many, it would feel fresh. And that realization quietly stripped veterans of their strongest bargaining chip. The argument that the league would collapse without them no longer held weight. Ratings wouldn't disappear. Sponsors wouldn't flee. Broadcasts wouldn't go dark. If anything, curiosity alone could sustain interest. This doesn't mean veterans aren't valuable. They are. But value is different from indispensability. And once that line gets crossed, negotiations stop being about fairness and start being about timing. For owners, the message was clear. Time favors the league. Every delayed season increases the visibility of incoming talent. Every stalled agreement makes rookies more appealing. Every internal division makes replacement easier to justify, not morally, but practically. And players felt it, not as a threat, as pressure. Because once replacement becomes a realistic outcome, the burden of risk shifts entirely. The league can wait. Players cannot. Which leads to the final piece of the puzzle, the one leadership never fully addressed. The money, and more specifically, where it's coming from. There was one fact hanging over every meeting, every protest, every demand, a fact so uncomfortable that it was rarely addressed directly. The WNBA has never turned a profit. Not once. That reality doesn't make headlines because it complicates the narrative. It doesn't fit neatly into slogans or social posts. But for owners, it's the only number that truly matters. From their perspective, the offers on the table weren't conservative. They were aggressive. They represented a massive gamble, one that assumed future growth, stronger media deals, and sustained fan interest. Owners weren't offering raises based on past success. They were betting on potential. That distinction is critical. When a business hasn't generated consistent returns, every dollar offered ahead of profitability carries risk. And the larger the offer, the harder it becomes to justify demands that go even further. This is where the disconnect widened. Players spoke about fairness. Owners spoke about sustainability. Players referenced cultural momentum. Owners referenced balance sheets. and neither side seemed willing or able to fully bridge that gap. What made the situation worse was the silence around this issue from union leadership. The profit question wasn't addressed head-on. It wasn't acknowledged and reframed. It was simply avoided. That avoidance weakened credibility. Because when fans, even casual ones, know the league hasn't made money, ignoring it feels dishonest. It creates the impression that demands are detached from reality, no matter how justified they might feel emotionally. Owners noticed this immediately. If the union wouldn't engage with financial reality publicly, owners had no incentive to concede privately. That's when negotiations stopped being about compromise and started becoming about endurance. Who could wait longer? Who could absorb more pressure? Who would blink first? And in that contest, the league held an advantage players didn't want to admit. Owners have diversified portfolios. They can afford losses. They can play the long game. Players can't. Careers are short. Injuries are permanent. Earning windows close fast. By refusing to engage honestly with the league's financial limitations, union leadership inadvertently strengthened the owner's position. Not because owners were right, but because they were grounded. The moment a negotiation loses grounding, it loses urgency. And once urgency disappears, power shifts decisively. That's why owners stopped reacting emotionally. That's why they stopped countering rhetoric. That's why they let time do the work. Because in a league still searching for stability, realism always outlasts ideology. And that realization set the stage for the final fracture, the one that turned this from a labor dispute into a leadership crisis. By this point, the fight had clearly moved beyond dollars and contracts. The money was real. The offers were historic. The opportunity was undeniable. And yet, everything remained frozen. That's when it became clear this wasn't a financial standoff anymore. It was a leadership crisis. Because strong unions don't just demand more, they adapt. They recognize when leverage shifts. They adjust strategy without fracturing trust. What happened here was the opposite. Messaging became rigid instead of responsive. Concerns from inside the player base went unacknowledged. Public optics were prioritized over internal reassurance. And worst of all, leadership never recalibrated when the ground changed beneath them. Once the salary figures went public, once replacement became a realistic conversation, once public opinion started sliding, a pivot was necessary. It never came. That failure created a vacuum. Players were being asked to sacrifice without clarity, to trust leadership without transparency, to wait indefinitely while the league quietly positioned itself to move forward regardless. And that's when the most dangerous shift occurred. Players stopped asking, "What's best for us?" They started asking, "Who is this really for?" That question lingers long after negotiations end. Because when players begin questioning leadership motives, not owners, unity collapses from the inside. And owners saw it. They didn't celebrate it. They didn't provoke it. They simply adjusted. At this stage, the league wasn't negotiating under pressure anymore. The union was. The longer this dragged on, the clearer the endgame became. Accept generational money now, or risk watching the league evolve without you. That's not a threat. It's a reality shaped by time, talent, and momentum. This moment will be remembered, not for the size of the offers, but for the choices made around them. For the first time, the WNBA stood at the edge of real financial transformation. The money wasn't symbolic. It wasn't conditional. It was tangible, immediate, and capable of changing lives across the roster. And yet, internal division stalled everything. What began as a fight for progress slowly turned into a test of leadership, trust, and alignment. The owners made their move and stepped back. The numbers did the talking. Time did the rest. Now the question facing players isn't whether they deserve more. It's whether waiting will cost them the very opportunity they fought to create. Because once generational money is turned down, there's no guarantee it ever returns. Momentum doesn't pause. Public support doesn't rewind. And leagues don't stand still for internal disputes. The power has already shifted. The only thing left undecided is how this chapter ends, and who pays the price for it. And if you want to stay ahead of stories like this, the ones shaping sports long before headlines catch up, make sure you're subscribed. Because the most important moves never happen on the court. They happen behind closed doors, long before everyone else realizes the game has changed.